be. When I get depressed at how boringly or how literally the Christian Bible is often treated in churches, my go-to cheerer-upper is the writer Annie Dillard. She has a memoir, one of her lesser-known writings, entitled An American Childhood. And in it, she reflects on her experience of having been sent to Sunday school in a Presbyterian church. She remembers her teachers as kind, if overly earnest. But the stories these nice people told were anything but tame. Why did they spread this scandalous document before our eyes? She wonders in retrospect. If they had read it, I thought, if they had read it, they would have hid it. They didn't recognize the vivid danger that through repeated exposure, we would catch a glimpse of its wild opposition to their world. Now, when I'm invited to preach and told, as Tegan told me, that I can choose whatever text I want, I usually chicken out and tend to go for one of the readings assigned for whatever this particular Sunday is in the Christian calendar. It does save a lot of time, as my choice is practically made for me. But the deeper reason I do it is that it invariably confronts me with a text, a reading that I might never have chosen. And then I have to search with you for what this scandalous document, with its vivid dangers, might be exposing us to this afternoon. And perhaps the first thing that strikes us with the passage that we just heard is that right at the start, the Apostle Paul focuses his listeners' attention on one very obvious fact. The message of dignity and liberation and resurrection power, known as the gospel of Jesus Christ, is not something that the Corinthians found or constructed for themselves. It's not a personal spirituality. It did not originate with them. It was given to them. Or more accurately, someone announced or gave it to them. It is as fragile and random and miraculous as that. In other words, the gospel is a relational event. It is announced. And you're not asked to approve it or even to accept it, but to receive it. And to receive it is to get caught up in what you heard, to find that it gets you, or maybe that it gets into you. It's to find yourself engaged in this crazy dynamic of dignity and liberation and resurrection power, which can be at times in wild opposition to your world. It's to discover that the gospel has become, as Paul says, the place in which you also now stand. The place through which you also are being attended to, in spite of all your misgivings and confusions. Now, if this all sounds a bit close to the bone, that's because it is. And for no one more so than Paul, whose backstory was about as chilling as they come. This intelligent, deeply law-abiding and well-educated rabbi had, of course, earlier in his life, been recruited into the ugly and methodical pursuit of deviant believers, otherwise known then as Jesus followers. And in the process, Paul, though he was then known as Saul, had somehow learned how to edit out of his vast religious knowledge and wisdom all of the truths that, if he had actually faced them, might have broken his heart. And as you may remember from one of those scandalous stories probably told to Annie Dillard in her Presbyterian Sunday school, it took an appearance by the risen Jesus, followed by a major breakdown, more politely referred to here as a conversion, to turn Paul around and get that heart to break, and finally see him headed off in another direction, residual trauma and all. So talk about being a poster child for the gospel's wild opposition to your world. Talk about announcing a scandalous gospel with its vivid dangers. But that's maybe the second thing to strike us in this reading. Paul, when he was Saul, had to begin to learn in the hardest way, no, in the most excruciating way possible, that brutal orthodoxy is the opposite of faith. That certainty destroys trust. That the proclamation of good news is never coercive. And that the gospel is most likely to be received, to take in others, when those doing the proclaiming are still in the process of being transformed themselves. Whether or not he was always aware of it, it is certainly true that the scars left by Saul's becoming Paul often did remain visible. Like right here in this passage, I hope with a flash of humor, when Paul recalls that he was at best, if you count, the 528th person to whom the risen Christ appeared. My God, he was still counting. And then, like a person still grieving, he has to keep reminding us, I persecuted, I relentlessly pursued the Church of God. And yet, many received the announcement of good news from this same Paul. It got into them. It was at times wildly opposed to their world, to how they lived. Paul himself was often challenged, sometimes disliked or mistrusted. But like an earworm, the announcement of good news the Corinthians had received could now not be unheard. That's all we can ever hope for, really. Good news that we cannot ever unhear. But in the meantime, maybe this passage also lands with us today as a kind of invitation. An invitation to see ourselves, to see Amakrodia as a strong link in that long chain of receiving and proclaiming and receiving that is sometimes referred to by scholars as the apostolic succession. Or to put it more bluntly, the process of hearing good news from those who clearly have not yet grasped all its implications, who clearly are still being saved themselves, and receiving that good news anyway. Because this passage does remind us that the process of handing on the faith is not as straightforward as some might have us believe. To hand something on to someone else, to hand something over to someone else, is to lose control over what happens next. That's exactly what the young Annie Dillard grasped. Why did the grown-ups allow us to see this scandalous document? She wondered. Did they not see its vivid dangers to their world? But we are here this afternoon because someone or some people handed the good news to us. They didn't, as Annie Dillard observed, they didn't hide it from us. If we were lucky, they were already conscious of its vivid dangers. But even if they were not yet, they still handed it to us. But we are receiving it as Paul understood receiving. To be unexpectedly caught up in what you hear. To find that it gets you. That it gets to you. And to discover that this is the place in which we also stand, willingly exposed to this scandalous document. This is the place through which we also are being attended to, so that we might become transparent to the grace and mercy of God, one vivid danger at a time. We're inclined to forget, I suppose, just how ambivalent many of Paul's colleagues remained towards him, because he has since become such a towering figure in the Christian tradition. But some just never trusted him, given his history. And still today, we ourselves continue with good reason a more than robust conversation with some of the writings attributed to him. But in a sense, living with that very vulnerability, that mistrust, made him the apostle he was. Though, of course, it didn't always make him right. It did, however, enable him to be a receiver of good news, whose hope was borne by the weight of his past. In time, it made him a teacher of good news from the depths of his own in perfect recovery. It made him a strong preacher whose only remaining certainty was the trustworthiness of God. And it made him a proclaimer of the good news, whose vivid dangers were still saving him. We are here this afternoon because some people, handed the good news to us. We received it, and it is still putting us at risk. Recovery takes a lifetime. Salvation is ongoing. Yet in our turn, in our way, in our fragilities, we are apostles with good news to announce. And this link in the chain, the one which is ours, will hold, firmly held in God's grasp. And so to God alone be the glory.